Hello, my name is Arief Setiawan. It's an honor for me to be a part of South Asian Modernisms program. So, given the time, instead of a comprehensive or an overarching discussions about modernism in Indonesia, what I'd like to do with this presentation is sharing with you a short story about contemporary modernism in present-day Indonesia. Let me start with these pictures. It is a work of Andra Matin, one of the most prominent practicing architects in present-day Indonesia. It's the Secret Garden in Ubud Valley. As you can see the design features, its geometrical clarity, simplicity, serenity, openness, a building made out of concrete, steel, but the overall idea of the building as a roof that hovers above a plinth. But you could also see here that the roof, instead of flat roof, it is a gable roof, and the architects expose parts of the structure, which are the wooden rafters. In another work of his, this is a cultural center in Jakarta. It's a geometric solids that floats above the ground. It's a celebration of openness, a concrete, steel and glass structure, but you could also see the play with textures and architectures in harmony with nature, even though it is in a very dense part of Jakarta. So how did we get into this? Let me give you just a glimpse of the beginning of modernism in Indonesia. It was brought by Dutch architects in the 1920s, but you could see from this series of pictures the narrative that these Dutch architects wanted to achieve. That was modern architecture that convey the sense of being in the Netherlands East Indies. That was the colonial name for Indonesia. Let me jump 40 years ahead from that to the mid 20th century, in which modernism has become an integral part of the narrative of the project of nation buildings, in which the universal aesthetic of modernism meant to convey the sense of Indonesia as a new emerging independent nations in Southeast Asia. And that kind of aesthetics, that kind of approach, that kind of expressions permeated in major projects, major buildings, as well as in ordinary buildings in many parts of Indonesia. And that gave us the first generations of Indonesian modernists, one of the most important of which was Friedrich Silaban. So here, his project for the national malls in Jakarta and some of the governmental buildings in the capital, as well as his own house. You could see here the universal aesthetics, as well as the emphasis on the brise soleil and the play of the roof, as those were parts of the efforts to relate modernism with the local context, both in climatic and cultural sense. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Indonesia transformed from a state-controlled economy to a market economy, and modernism in architecture was also an integral part of that, in which skyscrapers sprung in Indonesian metropolises. Even some were designed by expatriate architects like Paul Rudolph in Jakarta. And that led to reactions from Indonesian modernists. One of the most prominent, one of the most distinguished Indonesian architect, Mangun Wijaya, led a call for modern architecture that also expressed the sense of Indonesianness. So here, a gallery in Jakarta, you could see here his building sits side by side with a traditional building, a solid geometry that sits on top sits on stilts. But you could also see the celebrations of roof, an open space, an open plan that celebrates details, patterns, motifs, textures, materials, building structures. That those are explorations and celebrations of elements from Java architecture, one of the local tradition in Indonesia. And another project is a church in Central Java, which is basically a vast open space, which was a vehicle for him to explore the limits and possibilities of roof, because he argued that Indonesian architecture was essentially an umbrella that floats above an open space like this. And that provided a ground for young architects in Indonesia in the 1990s to call for a stronger expressions of Indonesia in architecture. They formed a group called Arsitek Muda Indonesia, or Young Indonesian Architect. You can see here from the designs that they produced in the 1990s, early 2000s. Beside explorations of Indonesia, you could also see that the designs from drawings, the design ideas, were pretty much a part of global tendency in architectural design. After the economic collapse and political reform in late 1990s and early 2000s, Indonesia emerged as democratic nations, but also much more entrenched in global capitalism. So this is the architecture, modernist architecture that we see in present days Indonesia, like Andra Matin's work, or Ridwan Kamil, another prominent Indonesian architect, or the long entrenched name in Indonesian architects, Atelier 6. So here, right, the diversities of contemporary modernism in Indonesia. Let me step back. What actually modernism in architecture brought to Indonesia? In a way, one way to understand this is to see that, like in these pictures and a snapshot of parts of Jakarta, that modernism has become a parts and parcels of everyday built environment. So both architecture in capital A and architecture in lowercase a. In terms of space, modernism brought in these types of space, a banal, anonymous, standardized space that spread across the archipelago, could be built fastly and cheaply in many different parts, in all different parts of Indonesia. The displacements of wisdoms and craftsmanship of knowledge in building constructions with standardized industrialist way of constructing buildings. And the backdrop of that is, just like in many parts of the world, a strong call for the expressions of identity, right, through the returns of traditions like this. Some of these contemporary buildings demonstrates, and which actually modernism has shown its capability to accommodate that call for expressions of identity, okay, in which modern space is clad over or add or topped by, okay, or added with, okay, elements derived from local traditional architecture. So modernism in Indonesia now has become parts of the vernacular of contemporary space, contemporary built environment. But yeah, as we all know, parts of the globalized world, the way to express being modern is not only referred to local sources or universal sources, but also snippets of images okay, from all over the world. Okay. So both in everyday architecture and as well as in architecture with capital A, okay, this diversity in contemporary modernisms, okay, exemplified by these varieties of design work. Okay. I would like to conclude again with work of Andromatin, in which yeah, um, modernisms in present-day Indonesia has shown its capacity to incorporate diversity, a diversity of ways in which we imagine ourselves, the intersections of local and global, but also the proliferations of different images collated into a modern design. Thank you for following my short story here, and thank you so much for your attention. Bye.